In February 1943, the fate of 21-year-old Sophie Scholl was sealed in a terrifying, screaming monologue, not a fair trial. She stood before Judge Roland Freisler. Just hours later, she was dead. Her crime, distributing anti-Nazi leaflets. Sophie Scholl was not an anomaly. Freisler sent over 5,000 people to their deaths during his reign, making him one of the most notorious legal figures in history. This is the story of how Roland Freisler became Germany's most feared judge, transforming the nation's justice system into a killing machine. Roland Freisler began his life and legal career with no outward sign of the monstrous brutality that was to come. Born in Celle in 1893, he entered the prestigious University of Vienna in 1912 to study law, showing a particular aptitude for complex legal theory and constitutional law. His academic promise was interrupted abruptly in 1914 when he was drafted into the Imperial German Army at the outbreak of World War I. He fought bravely on the Eastern Front, earning the Iron Cross. However, in 1915, a pivotal and formative moment occurred. He was captured by Russian forces and interned in a Siberian prison camp for the rest of the war. For 4 years, Freisler, a disciplined German officer, was immersed in a world populated by hardened Bolsheviks and Marxist revolutionary thinkers. His later writings, though fiercely anti-communist, reveal a strange, almost clinical admiration for the structure, discipline, and ruthless revolutionary energy of the communist model. He saw a system that could entirely replace one set of laws with a radically new, purpose-driven doctrine, a concept he would later apply with terrifying effect to the Nazi state. Upon his return to the shattered Germany of 1918, Freisler immediately resumed his legal education. By 1920, he had earned his doctorate with high distinction for a complex dissertation on maritime law. The early years of his career, spent as a defense attorney in Kassel, are the most contradictory to his later infamy. Colleagues remembered him as a meticulous and fiercely intelligent lawyer, often winning acquittals through sheer technical mastery of legal arguments. He was a vocal critic of the state, writing in a 1921 article that judges must resist the temptation to decide cases based on personal impressions rather than evidence. He emphasized procedural fairness and warned explicitly against judicial overreach. The turning point was definitive and chillingly swift. In 1925, Freisler joined the Nazi Party. Former colleagues noted an immediate, profound shift in his behavior and legal philosophy. Where he had once championed the rights of the individual within a fair process, he now called for national renewal through radical, revolutionary legal reform. His personal writings began to prioritize the health of the Volksgemeinschaft, the key German racial community over any individual, inalienable rights. By 1930, Freisler had left private practice behind to work, full-time for the party. His transformation from a principled lawyer to an ideological enforcer was complete, laying the foundation for the total destruction of Germany's justice system. As state secretary in the Reich Ministry of Justice from 1934, Roland Freisler began the systematic dismantling of Germany's centuries-old legal protections. His method was insidious. He didn't just ignore the law, he corrupted it with precise legal language. One of his first major acts was helping craft the infamous 1935 Nuremberg laws. These laws codified racism, defining Jewish identity, and outlawing any relationship between Jews and non-Jews. Freisler provided the crucial legal justification. He notoriously argued that German judges could recognize Jews and categorize them racially the same way he claimed U.S. judges identified black people. Despite the total absence of any rational legal criteria, Freisler introduced the destructive doctrine that a judge's racial instinct, Richter instinct, should take precedence over evidence and established jurisprudence. Freisler was also the architect behind the 1939 Juvenile Felons Decree, a law that stands as one of the darkest legal achievements of the regime. This decree, a shocking first in German legal history, allowed courts to sentence minors, children, to death. At least 72 young people were executed under this decree. The most famous case was that of 17-year-old Helmut Hubener, who was hanged in 1942 for distributing anti-war leaflets. Freisler defended these executions with cold brutality, declaring, "In times of war, breaches of loyalty and baseness cannot find any leniency and must be met with the full force of the law." His efforts were not limited to political dissenters. Freisler actively targeted Jewish and Romani children, proposing in 1935 to label them legally incompetent or national parasites, allowing the state to seize them from their families without due process. Freisler's court rulings began to introduce pseudoscientific terms like perpetrator type and national parasite, embedding racial ideology directly into the very language of German law. By 1938, as head of the Penal Law Division, Freisler had overseen the chilling removal of over 2,000 Jewish judges and lawyers from their positions. In 1941, he personally ordered that yellow badges be issued and worn by all Jewish prisoners in Reich prisons. He also worked directly with regional Nazi leaders to standardize and accelerate death penalties for Jews and Poles in occupied territories, applying them even to deportees en route to the east. Under Freisler's influence, concepts like high treason were redefined to enable death sentences for the most trivial acts, including anti-Nazi jokes or simply listening to foreign radio. By 1939, Freisler had successfully replaced centuries of established legal tradition with a racial and ideological dogma, paving the way for the courtroom to become a fully legalized weapon of war. Roland Freisler's formal appointment as president of the Volksgerichtshof, the People's Court, in August 1942 was the formal conversion of a judicial body into a mechanized instrument of state murder. Freisler turned the courtroom into a terrifying psychological and visual stage. The chamber itself was draped in massive, scarlet swastika banners and bathed in harsh directional lighting. Freisler, clad in a voluminous blood-red judicial robe, a deliberate, theatrical choice to symbolize the blood justice of the Führer, created a spectacle designed to crush the defendant's spirit before a single word of testimony was given. The setting was no accident. It was a pure display of Nazi power intended to instill absolute fear. Under Freisler's fanatical direction, the court became ruthlessly efficient, its sole output being death. Trials were often reduced to 15-minute formalities, brief, screaming rituals that culminated in a predetermined death sentence. Freisler personally presided over the First Senate, which became the deadliest judicial body in German history. Consider the stark statistics of Freisler's tenure. Total death sentences. Freisler personally signed or issued over 2,600 death sentences in his less than 2.5 years as president. This is more than all other divisions of the People's Court had issued combined in the entire 8 years prior to his arrival. Execution rate under his leadership. The conviction rate soared and stabilized at over 90%, with death sentences becoming the standard penalty for any perceived act of political dissent. Historical comparison. To put this brutality in context, the People's Court issued more death sentences during the Nazi era than all German civil courts had issued in the preceding 70 years. Freisler demanded total control, reviewing every case himself. In a chilling display of sadism, he often dictated the specific method of execution, showing a distinct preference for slow strangulation, with piano wire for those he deemed particularly despicable traitors, an agonizing, degrading method meant to prolong suffering. His interrogations were infamous for their psychological cruelty. He would shift abruptly between cold, calculated questions and explosive tirades, often screaming until his voice gave out. These courtroom performances were acts of total dehumanization, designed to break the accused before the sentence was even read. The White Rose trial became Roland Freisler's first major spectacle of terror, a brutal public display of how he intended to silence youth dissent. On February 18, 1943, the Gestapo arrested Sophie and Hans Scholl, along with Christoph Probst, for distributing anti-Nazi leaflets that exposed atrocities and called for non-violent resistance. Freisler was dispatched immediately from Berlin. He arrived in Munich 4 days later, determined to make a horrific example of them. He deliberately scheduled the trial for a Saturday, ensuring that the public, particularly students and workers, could watch the state's retribution. Freisler's conduct during the trial was a masterpiece in psychological domination. He interrupted Sophie Scholl an estimated 84 times, shouting her down every time she tried to explain their ethical motives. Witnesses recount a terrifying moment when Freisler, enraged by a defendant's calm demeanor, hurled the heavy penal codebook toward the defendants, forcing Hans Scholl to physically duck, a shocking snapshot of his theatrical cruelty. The outcome, of course, had been decided long before the trial even began. Execution orders were signed in advance. The original sentence was to be hanging, but the method was swiftly changed to guillotine to avoid the visual of a traditional hanging, which might, ironically, create martyrs. Later, guillotine operators revealed that Freisler timed the executions to occur precisely between his lunch breaks, treating death like a trivial clerical task. At the second White Rose trial on April 19, 1943, involving other members of the group, Freisler opened by declaring, "National Socialism does not need a criminal code against such traitors as you are. I will make this process with you short." The second trial lasted less than a day, ending with 3 more death sentences and 9 prison terms. The Scholl siblings were executed just hours after their trial. Witnesses recalled their calm composure, with their final words famously recorded as, "Long live freedom." Freisler's handling of the White Rose cases was not justice. It was terror in a red robe, the clearest example of how the courtroom had been deliberately transformed into a deadly weapon. Freisler's courtroom was also a carefully managed propaganda machine. Selected trials were not just documented. They were filmed by a dedicated camera crew for Nazi radio and film reels. Microphones amplified Freisler's volcanic shouts and, conversely, magnified the defendant's stammers, silence, and humiliation. The July 20th plot trials in August 1944, concerning the attempt to assassinate Hitler, became Freisler's most elaborate and brutal stage performance. The proceedings were filmed for nationwide broadcast, with cameras carefully positioned to capture every moment of degradation. Freisler transformed the courtroom into a propaganda set, complete with theatrical lighting and booming, amplified microphones. He meticulously staged the defendants' appearances. They were forced to wear shabby, ill-fitting clothes, often deprived of belts or suspenders. Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, a decorated officer, was forced to hold up his trousers with one hand while Freisler screamed accusations at him. Other defendants were made to look physically defeated and unkempt, as if their guilt was already a foregone physical conclusion. Prison staff reportedly denied bathroom breaks to men like von Witzleben to increase their distress. The trials followed a strict choreography designed to utterly break the accused. Freisler interrupted them literally hundreds of times, shouting vile insults like, "You really are a lousy piece of trash." Microphones captured every stammer and moment of hesitation. Shockingly, court transcripts record multiple instances of defendants vomiting from stress and psychological torment they endured. Freisler personally oversaw the editing of the trial footage, selecting only the most degrading and humiliating moments for broadcast. Close-ups showed defendants sweating, trembling, or fumbling for words, while any coherent defense or explanation of motive was deliberately cut. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels praised the films as perfect demonstrations of the people's justice, using them to reinforce the Nazi regime's narrative of strength and order. The calculated cruelty extended to the execution orders. Sentences often specified slow strangulation with piano wire. Afterward, the bodies of the executed conspirators were hung from meat hooks in a Berlin warehouse, displayed like trophies. Freisler's obsession was not just with punishment, but with total final domination. The edited trial highlights were then distributed to factories, military units, and schools, turning executions into state-sponsored lessons in absolute obedience. On February 3, 1945, a powerful Allied bombing raid struck the center of Berlin. One bomb hit Roland Freisler's courtroom in the People's Court, building mid-session. Freisler was killed instantly, crushed by a falling beam as he desperately tried to flee the collapsing building. He died clutching legal files, the very papers, belonging to Fabian von Schlabrendorf, a July 20th plot conspirator whose trial Freisler had just begun. Miraculously, von Schlabrendorf, who had been standing just steps from Freisler when the blast hit, was later retried by a less fanatical judge, acquitted, and survived the war. Years later, von Schlabrendorf rose to become a judge on West Germany's highest court, the Federal Constitutional Court, a profound and living symbol of how justice, once fatally corrupted, could ultimately be reborn. Roland Freisler's death did not instantly end the terror, but it removed its chief architect. His system of judicial terror remains a chilling testament to how legal, intellect, and discipline can be weaponized against morality and humanity. Freisler's legacy is the most potent historical example of a lawyer who did not just fail to uphold the law, but meticulously and skillfully engineered its total destruction in the service of a criminal state.